The storm that night out through the valley like an angry spirit, shaking the trees until their roots screamed. When dawn finally broke, a grey silence settled over the forest, a silence broken only by one sound, a cry. It came from beneath the twisted roots of a fallen pine, faint and desperate. Elias Rowe, a 70-year-old widow living alone in a small cabin, followed that sound through the mud and rain. What he found was no ordinary creature, a dying bobcat kitten, bigger than each hint. He didn't know it yet, but saving that life would one day save each own. They evastic with the scent of wet earth and pine sap. Elias moved slowly, which but sinking into the mud with every step. The storm had passed, but its fury lingered, broken branches, torn soil, a forest stripped bare. For most people, it was destruction. For Elias, it was just another morning alone. Since Clara died, the world had grown unbearably quiet. The laughter, the warmth, the small rituals of shared life, all gone. He spoke only to the wind now, and sometimes to the old jays that still visited Uchaya's porch. Clara named you, it mer. Guess you're all we got left, точка. That morning, as he checked the damage along Uchaya's property line, a faint sound made him stop. It wasn't the rustle of a squirrel or the whistle of the wind. It was something small. Something crying. She froze, listening again. Then he heard it. 18, trembling CRYZ rosy and fell with the RHYTHM of the wind. He followed the sound to where a massive pine had fallen, its roots torn from the ground. Beneath the tangle of soil and rock, something moved. Elias knelt, pushing aside branches and mud until he saw it, a tiny ball of fur, shivering violently. A bobcat kitten. Two otters lay beside it, already still, their tiny bodies all buried in the earth. The matter was gone. Only this one clung to life. She stared at it, torn between instinct and reason. Leave it, he muttered. That's the way of things, точка. But as he turned away, Clara's voice echoed in Uchaya's mind. Here is kindness, and here is kindness, Yelito. He sighed, Uchaya's a stinging. Damn it, Clara, точка. Gently, he lifted the fragile creature, wrapping it inside Uchaya's flannel shirt. The kitten's heartbeat was faint, but steady. All right, little one, he whispered. You and I, you see what happens next, точка. And just like that, two lost souls began their story together. The cabin smelled of wet wood and smog as Elias placed the tiny bundle near the fire. The kitten's fur was sucked, its breathing shallow, each rise of its chest a small miracle. Elias wasn't sure what he was doing, he only knew he'd sold and do nothing. He filled an old tin cup with our milk, poured it into a syringe, and pressed the drops gently between the kitten's lips. The creature resisted at first, too weak to swallow. Then, a faint flicker of life, a twitch, a swallow, a sound that sold Weben a sigh. Elias exhaled too, realizing he'd been holding Uchaya's breath. He stayed up all night, the flames painting Uchaya's lined face in gold and shadow. Every 2 hours, he fed the kitten, rubbing its belly with a damp cloth to help it survive. Uchaya's old clock ticked swiftly. Tick, breathe, feed, pray. Hours slipped by. Outside, the storm finally calmed, leaving behind a silence so deep it felt holy. At dawn, he dozed off in Uchaya's chair. A sharp sound startled him awake. The kitten was crying, stronger this time, almost demanding. Its eyes were still closed, but it was alive. Elias smiled, something he hadn't done in years. You're a fighter, Haer, he whispered. Guess that makes two of us, точка. He built a little box near the fire, lined it with an old towel, and placed the kitten inside. The small heartbeat echoed in Uchaya's chest like a forgotten RHYTHM. By evening, the tiny creature had drunk half a bottle of milk and even tried to growl. Au court, determined, stubborn. Elias slept swiftly. Stubborn's good, he said. It means you belong here, точка. As the day faded into another quiet night, Elias stared at the kitten resting near the fire and felt something unfamiliar, warmed. Not from the flames, but from the fragile promise of life. In the middle of nowhere, two lonely hearts had found each other, and for the first time in years, the silence inside Elias' cabin didn't feel empty. It felt alive. Weeks passed, and the tiny heartbeat Elias had rescued began to fill the cabin with a new RHYTHM. Ze kitteren stil na melis groes straunger, hor fair turning from dull brown to a soft golden pattern of spots and stripes. She learned to crawl, 10 climb, 10 pounds on anything that moved, including Yelia's boots. One evening, as she leaped to the shores, Elias choke aired. All right, easy they are, little aurir tochk. The or to aurir lingered in each's mind until it found its shape. Runner, he said swiftly. Huts you are named. The kitten looked up, tail fleeting as if to angry. Runner beat him with his shadow. When he hit the roof, she watched from the window. When he read by the fire, she gurgled beside his feet. She was wild, yet unafraid something between the forest and the firelight. Elias often caught himself talking to her as if she understood every word. And sometimes she told her in that gurier's way that made him believe she did. But even as the band deepened, the truth loomed quietly behind it. Runner was not his pet, she was a creature of the wild. The outcome when instinct would call her home. Elias built her iron or door enclosure behind the cabin, a space filled with logs, stands, and shadows where she could climb and hunt. You need to remember who you are, it whispered, clutching a small rabbit carcass near the fence. The forest will call you one day, and I won't stop you to. At night, it sit outside the cage with a book, reading aloud. Runner would crouch nearby, eyes glowing in the firelight, listening in her quiet, feral way. Each night ended the same, the old man's voice, the sound of the forest, and the quiet pulse of understanding between two leaves that never should be met yet somehow were meant to. By late summer, the forest round Yelia's cabin was alive gangrene, humming, endless. Runner had grown into a powerful young bobcat, her ancestors' paws now silent and sure. Her golden eyes shimmered with something unremarkable. Elias watched her from the porch as she stalked the grass, every step graceful, precise, wild. He knew what it meant. The time was coming. The nights had grown restless. Runner began pacing along the fence line, her head turning towards the dark trees, ears flicking at every rustle. Instinct was calling her home, whispering through the wind and pine needles. Elias could feel it to a quiet ache inside his chest. One morning, she didn't eat. She sat near the gate, staring into the woods. Elias approached slowly, the air heavy with unspoken truth. So, he said swiftly, you're ready, aren't you? Runner turned, her eyes locking onto his. There was no fear, no hesitation, only understanding. The kind that words could never touch. Elias spent the day preparing for her release. He packed the great whisker, did a blanket that still smelled faintly of the cabin, and a small piece of neither her favorite. The drive to the mountain ridge was silent, just the rumble of the old truck and the soft breathing from the creek beside him. When they reached the clearing, Elias opened the door. The air was cool and sweet with the scent of rain-soaked pine. Runner stepped out cautiously, her body blending with the forest around her. She turned once, met his gaze, and made a British of a sound both farewell and thank you. Be wild, Elias whispered. Be free, Tochk. 10. In a single, fluid motion, she vanished into the green. Elias stood there long after she was gone, his hands trembling, his eyes wet. She had done what he was meant to do, let go of something beautiful. But as he drove back home alone, the silence in the cabin felt different now. It wasn't empty. It was secret. 4 years had passed since that morning on the ridge, the day Elias let Runner disappear into the wild. Seasons turned, and the world again with him. His ancestral hands had grown slower, his steps careful, each breath heavier than before. Yet every so often, he would find faint paw prints near the creek, too large to belong to any horse record. Each time, his chest tightened. You're still out there, aren't you? It whispered to the wind. By the autumn of his 77th year, the storm they had returned, cold, relentless, and full of memory. The rain came in long shots, hammering the tin roof like 8 hours and whispers. For 3 days, Elias stood inside, watching the forest vanish behind a curtain of grey. On the 4th day, he noticed one of the fence posts near the creek had fallen. Logic told him to wait. But habit, that old, stubborn part of him, pushed him to go. It will only take a minute, he muttered, grabbing his coat and hammer. The air outside beat through his jacket. The ground was slig, the creek swollen and angry, brown water clawing at the banks. He moved slowly, testing each step. When he reached the post, which is but he gave a sharp crack of pain, the same hip that had carried him through years of labor and loneliness. Which his foot slipped. There was no time to catch himself. The were tilted, and he crashed down the embankment. Which his had struck a rock, a boast of pain, and silence. Cold water swallowed him whole. He gasped, cogging on modern eyes, the current dragging him deep. He tried to grab at branches, but which his right leg refused to move. The pain was sharp, electric. He was bleeding. Which his breath came ragged. Not like this, he whispered weakly to the storm. But the current only roared louder, pulling him away. And then, through the blur of rain and water, he saw Whitey, a shadow on the river bank. Still, watching. A bobcat. The word around him was a blur of rain and pain. Yellow's hands clouded the mud, trying to hold on, but which his strength was fading fast. Every breath burned like fire, every heartbeat slower than the last. The storm raged above him, mere silence and loud, but through it he heard something else. A sound la and guttural, a growl. From the curtain of rain, a shape emerged there, slick, powerful, and impenetrably familiar. Golden as caught through the storm like lanterns. The bobcat stepped closer, her fur mattered from the rain, her muscles coiled in tension. Elias blinked, vision swimming. Runner, he gasped. The wildcat stood at the edge of the water, watching him, cautious, ear-ceasing. Then, with a snarl, she leaped. Her paws hit the shallow edge, splashing through the current. She beat down on the sleeve of which he caught and pulled, her body trembling with effort. Elias tried to help, digging his fingers into the mud, but he was too weak. Still, she didn't stop. She growled again, a deep, primal sound, and tugged it harder. Inch by inch, she dragged him towards the bank. The storm fought against her, wind hurling like a living thing, but the bobcat fought harder. Finally, with one last pull, Elias' body rolled onto solid ground. She coughed violently, cocking up river water. The bobcat stood over him, panting. Her sides heaved with exhaustion, her fur plastered to her ribs. For a moment, neither of the air moved, just two survivors in the rain. Then Runner laid her head and pressed her nose gently to his cheek, a gesture that said everything words could not. Elias reached up with a trembling hand and brushed her fur. "You came back," he whispered, tears lost in the rain. Runner blinked slowly, that same calm, understanding look from years ago, and then lifted her head toward the forest. For a moment, she stood guard, her body between him and the storm, like a sentinel carved from the wild itself. That night, the wilderness didn't feel cruel anymore. Métis felt alive, and it remembered it. The storm passed before dawn. The rescue team found Elias hours later, auf Chonchios near the creek, which is Paul's faint but alive. They said a wild animal must have kept him warm through the night. There were paw prints all around him, circling which is body like a silent guardian. But when they asked what happened, Elias only smiled weakly and said, she remembered it. He spent 3 weeks in the small county hospital. Which his leg healed slowly, but which his spirit, strangely, felt lighter than 18 years. When he finally returned home, the forest greeted him with quiet sunlight and the sound of dripping pine. The cabin smelled of smoke, dust, and memory. Days turned into months. Winter came end to end. And every so often, it felt that familiar sense of being watched. Sometimes, it find fresh tracks near the porch, or a Alpha-10 rabbit laid neatly beside each steps. Gifts, perhaps. Signals that somewhere out there, the wild still carried his name. Then one golden morning in late spring, as he sat by the window with a cup of tea and the radio humming softly, he saw a movement near the tree line. Sea froze. Out from the forest came a figure, slick, confident, golden-eyed. Runner. Behind her, 2 smaller shapes followed, young bobcats, cautious but curious. They stood close to their at her side. Elias stepped outside slowly, not wanting to break the moment. Runner stood still, her gaze locked on him. The forest went silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Elias smiled, tears glimmering in his tired eyes. "You did good, girl," he whispered. "You made it touch." Runner blinked once, slow, deliberate. Kensche turned, nas rolled one of four cobs, and slipped back into the trees, disappearing into the gold and green of the wild. Elias watched until the last rosal faded. The world felt whole again. In saving one life, he hit on knowingly saved each his own. And in that quiet clearing, where man and wild had once met, the forest spake again, not with words, but with memory, love, and the kind of silence that never truly ends.